Gavin Newsom publicly labeled Trump a parasitic threat in front of countless media cameras. He was positioned as the clear Democratic frontrunner for the 2028 election, governing the fifth largest economy in the world and representing his party's brightest hope for the future. However, just a month after this legislative clash, his standing in primary polls collapsed to third place. His primary advisor turned against him to cooperate with the Department of Justice. A sprawling federal corruption investigation targeted his administration, and a devastating six-word attack, "You cannot manage California," became the only ammunition rivals like Whitmer, Shapiro, and Buttigieg needed. Destroy that like button, because you are about to see what happens when the country's most carefully crafted governor meets a shockingly quiet version of Donald Trump, and how that strategic silence caused more destruction than his typical yelling ever could. Mr. President, you are a found guilty felon leading a government that has violated more laws in 18 months than any previous administration in recorded history. You are tearing apart the White House's East Wing to build a dining hall, and you represent a parasitic threat to our republic. Taking his seat at the witness table in the House chamber, Newsom projected the demeanor of a statesman who had been practicing for this specific clash since the very moment he decided to run for president, which, historically speaking, was the day he was born. This bipartisan committee hearing, dedicated to investigating federal oversight of local fraud and governmental breakdowns, was initiated after Trump announced on Truth Social that a sweeping investigation into California was underway. Every major news channel broadcast the event nonstop. The public gallery was overflowing, and the press area was completely full. The media fully understood what was on the line. The presumed 2028 Democratic nominee was confronting his ultimate political rival, facing his most critical public test. Newsom typically excelled in these settings, having always dominated such theatrical arenas. His appearance, his perfectly fitted suit, his rhythm, and his finely tuned Californian voice made him sound like a high-end radio host who had somehow been handed the governorship. For 7 years, he had built his career on being the complete opposite of Trump, offering polish where Trump offered friction. He was calm where Trump was volatile, and administrative where Trump was chaotic, making this stark contrast his defining political identity. This profound difference served as the bedrock of his campaign and fundamentally stood as the primary argument for his presidential aspirations. California is the world's fifth most powerful economic machine, home to 40 million people, and we lead the globe in technology, agriculture, entertainment, and renewable energy, so I will absolutely not tolerate lectures on governance from a man who bankrupted casinos. The room split, with the left side erupting into applause. Sitting in the second row, Newsom's political advisors exchanged that knowing, look, operatives give when their candidate perfectly lands a rehearsed punch. Yet, the same governor bragging about his massive economy was simultaneously responsible for the most disastrous unemployment fraud crisis in the nation's history. A staggering $31 billion had been handed out to criminal organizations, death row inmates, and organized hacking groups based in Russia, China, and Romania. At the same time, his top advisor was staring down federal charges for trying to claim a $15,000 designer Chanel purse as a valid business expense. At the center desk, President Donald J. Trump sat completely silent as Newsom delivered his opening attack. He wasn't nervously quiet, nor was he distracted by a phone. He was entirely motionless. It was the deliberate quiet of a master negotiator allowing his opponent to use all their ammunition, fully aware that his retaliation would be far more destructive as a result. He offered a small internal smirk, the exact same look he had used during the Omar hearings. Governor, that was a beautiful speech, truly beautiful, but perhaps you should examine the actual economy you are managing. Trump replied. Opening a file marked with a gold tab, he continued, let's start with $31 billion. During 2020 and 2021, California's Employment Development Department, the agency you directly oversee to manage unemployment, paid out approximately $31 billion to fraudulent claims, marking the largest theft of unemployment funds in American history. He pronounced the number with his signature methodical pace, displaying the restraint of a businessman who knows that astronomical numbers need silence to be truly comprehended. I have built massive commercial projects, Governor, and created unimaginable wealth, but I have never lost $31 billion, nor has anyone else. This isn't just a scandal, it is a historical milestone, and you hold the gold medal for the biggest financial loss in government history. Congratulations. Newsom's famous jawline, his standard media-facing expression, tightened. It was the same look of unbothered authority he had maintained since taking office in 2019, tightening almost imperceptibly in a highly professional manner. This was the involuntary reflex of a man used to hostile situations, knowing that controlling his facial expressions was the golden rule of optical warfare. However, the tightening happened, and the C-SPAN cameras captured it from a low angle, making it blatantly visible on any decent-sized screen. $1 billion of that total went to prisoners locked in your state's jails under your direct control, Governor. And this includes, I want everyone to hear this, Scott Peterson, a man on death row for murdering his pregnant wife, who collected unemployment from your state. The distinct sound echoed through the room, neither a laugh nor a gasp. It was the unique murmur a collective makes when confronted with a fact so precise it becomes horrifying. Newsom shifted his perfectly manicured hands, which typically moved with the fluid grace of a West Coast politician who had spent 30 years learning that gestures create good television. His right hand moved to cover his left in a subtle motion. It was a slow interlacing of fingers, signaling an involuntary retreat into a defensive stance. An underground Memphis rapper known as Nuke Bizzle filmed a music video bragging about stealing from your EDD, and the video, literally titled EDD, is still on YouTube. He filmed himself holding stacks of your taxpayers' unemployment money for the world to see, and your staff completely missed it until the feds found it. The room broke into laughter, that specific kind of Trump-era laughter triggered not by a joke, but by undeniable, documented absurdity. International crime rings from Russia, China, and Romania filed claims from overseas, meaning people who never worked a day in America or set foot in California were taking your Treasury's money because your administration removed basic fraud protections. Pulling out another document, Trump added, the Senate Finance Committee found that your labor secretary, Julie Su, who President Biden later promoted, deliberately suspended standard unemployment verification rules against federal guidelines. She actively destroyed the exact systems meant to stop this fraud. Leaning into his microphone, Newsom countered, Mr. President, the EDD issue was a national, but Trump immediately cut him off. Trump continued at the exact same volume and pace, using an executive tone so uncharacteristic for him that it was far more unsettling than his usual shouting. It felt exactly like a notoriously loud man dropping his voice to a quiet whisper. Haywood Talcove, CEO of LexisNexis Risk Solutions and a top fraud expert, explicitly warned federal authorities against authorizing the funds this way, predicting it would cause the largest fraud event in American history. He warned your entire system before the disaster even happened, yet your administration threw out the rulebook anyway. Newsom's half-finished defense hung in the air. His words were cut short, not by screaming, but by an opponent who simply refused to stop talking. He had been trying to argue it was a nationwide dilemma impacting all 50 states, but the opportunity was gone. His mouth closed over the broken sentence like a hand failing to catch a falling coin. His lips tightened as his brain frantically calculated whether to restart the sentence or abandon it. He chose to abandon it exhaling a tiny breath through his nose in a visible sign of surrender. He released the air he had saved for words that would never be spoken. To make matters worse, your EDD hired Phyllis Hope Stitt to catch scammers during the lockdowns, but in January 2026, she pled guilty to stealing $750,000 from the very program she was supposed to protect. The guard you hired was actually the thief. That same month, because California corruption always comes in pairs, former Madera County worker Leticia Mariscal was charged with stealing $40,000 in food stamp money, stealing directly from the hungry people she was hired to assist. Holding up another document, Trump quoted California Assemblyman David Tangipa, a member of your own state legislature, not a conservative pundit, stated that Sacramento is drowning in a culture of corruption. He pointed that accusation at the very top, and Governor, you are the top. Newsom's neck, which had supported his flawless posture through 3 decades of politics, began to change color. It wasn't a deep red flush of total embarrassment, but a subtle warmth caused by rising blood pressure, expanding the tiny vessels beneath his collar, signaling a subconscious panic. This slight change in skin tone was only visible to those watching the high-definition C-SPAN feed on large televisions. However, to the 20 million people watching those screens, it was incredibly obvious that the man's body was experiencing an emergency his face was desperately trying to hide. While $31 billion flowed to foreign gangs, prisoners, and rappers, actual working Californians whose jobs you destroyed were trapped in overwhelmed EDD phone lines for months, facing frozen accounts and severe distress, all while your agency paid Scott Peterson. Setting the paper down, Trump noted, $31 billion is more than the entire GDP of Iceland or Vermont. You lost more money to street criminals than the total output of whole countries. And while I've done massive deals, I've never seen anyone lose that much without going to federal prison. Yet your bureaucrats get raises while the criminals get music videos. Turning the page, Trump pivoted. Now let's talk about the money you lost to your own arrogance. The 6th of November, 2020. He spoke the date with the precision of a prosecutor eager to drop a bombshell. While you threatened 40 million citizens with legal action if they celebrated Thanksgiving, you were partying at the French Laundry in Napa Valley with 12 people, spending $350 a person indoors with no masks and no social distancing. He held up a printed photograph, which immediately appeared on the room's giant screens. The image showed an unmasked Newsom packed tightly with friends inside a glass-enclosed patio. Your staff claimed it was an outdoor dinner, but this KTTV photo proves the glass doors were closed because your group was being too loud, meaning you weren't just breaking your own laws, you were breaking them loudly. The crowd erupted into sustained laughter, caught in Trump's signature rhythm where devastating facts serve as both punchline and prosecution, leaving the audience unable to separate the joke from the indictment. Newsom tried to deploy his famous camera-ready smile, the exact grin that had protected him through countless media attacks and recall campaigns during his 7 years in power. That smile was his oldest defense mechanism, projecting a confident arrogance that suggested he was above the fray. But this time, his smile clashed directly with a room actively laughing at him. This clash between his standard grin and the audience's mockery created an expression the media had never before captured on his face. It was a brief micro-expression trapped painfully between a confident smirk and a distressed grimace. It looked like a man whose facial muscles were trying to project amusement while his nervous system was drowning in public embarrassment. Both impulses fought for control of his face for just a fraction of a second. The high-definition cameras caught this single frame, a paralyzed half-smirk, half-grimace, which was immediately destined to become the defining image of the hearing. You forced devastating lockdowns on 40 million people that crushed small businesses, and separated families, and then you happily broke those rules at a restaurant where one meal costs more than most of your citizens make in a day. I never told anyone to cancel Thanksgiving, Newsom fired back. Yes, you did, and then you went out and dined, Trump said, letting the tension build. He then dropped the comedic tone, replacing it with something icy. You were sitting next to Dustin Corcoran, the CEO of the California Medical Association, whose organization dictated your COVID policies and explicitly told the public to cancel Thanksgiving. So the medical executive demanding isolation and the governor enforcing it were dining shoulder to shoulder with the CMA's top lobbyist, Janus Norman, spending $350 a plate without masks while 40 million Californians were trapped at home. Do you know who missed out on the French Laundry? Maria from Fresno, who sat alone in her house because she actually trusted her governor's orders. Newsom reached out with his right arm, took a sip of water, and set the glass down. The movement was careful and controlled, a physical trick politicians use to give their stressed bodies a task to hide their panic. However, the simple act of drinking was a huge giveaway. A confident politician does not need a drink of water just 22 minutes into a hearing. Reaching for water this early proves that adrenaline has completely shut down the salivary glands. Even the Sacramento Bee, your state's top paper and hardly a right-wing outlet, called it haute cuisine hypocrisy. They poetically wrote that nothing would launder the stain of stupidity from his reputation after this ill-conceived outing. I didn't say that your own friendly press did 4 years ago, and you've added plenty more scandals since. Newsom's smile completely vanished, replaced by a flat, neutral stare. For a politician famous for his aggressive charm, this sudden neutrality looked like a terrifying emptiness. All of his charisma disappeared, leaving a face that functioned mechanically but felt entirely hollow. He looked like a leader whose emotional defenses had been ripped away, leaving him scrambling for a backup plan. Moving on to 2023, you signed a law raising the minimum wage for fast food workers to $20 an hour in the name of fairness. Yet the bill included a bizarre loophole for restaurants that bake standalone bread. Locking eyes with the governor, Trump said that loophole was custom built for Panera Bread, and the biggest Panera owner in America is Greg Flynn, a personal friend and corporate ally who has given you over $164,800 in campaign funds and bought a Napa resort managed by your company. You bypassed lawmakers to write a secret exemption just for him. Your voters paid the $20 wage while your friend got a pass, and you casually brushed it off to reporters as part of the sausage making. Newsom's left hand grabbed the edge of the table and squeezed tightly. This wasn't a relaxed pose, but a desperate physical reaction to a body demanding stability. His knuckles turned slightly white for 2 seconds before he pulled his hand back, signaling to everyone that his confidence was gone and his system was flooded with stress. But Panera is just the appetizer. Let's talk about Dana Williamson, your chief of staff, your gatekeeper, and the shadow boss of your administration, who was hit with federal corruption charges in November 2025 for allegedly stealing $225,000 from a dead campaign account and faking $1.7 million in corporate tax expenses. Trump read through the criminal charges, slowly, agonizingly detailing each item. A $15,000 Chanel handbag claimed as a business expense. A private jet flight claimed as a business expense, generating cascading laughter. A $170,000 birthday trip to Mexico claimed as a business expense, fueling even louder laughter. Every single expense sounded like a joke, but each punchline was an actual federal crime. The mixture of sheer absurdity and severe illegality was intoxicating to the crowd. She also faked documents to steal federal pandemic funds for her own consulting business, meaning your top aide was robbing the exact same COVID relief vault that the cartels were simultaneously emptying. Dropping the indictment papers on his desk, Trump noted, "When she resigned, you said you would deeply miss her massive heart. Following a heavy pause, he struck, "Governor, you missed much more than her heart. You missed her massive expense reports." The room erupted into the loudest roar of the day, coming from both sides of the political aisle. The Democrats didn't want to laugh, but the sentence was delivered with such perfect comedic timing that it bypassed political loyalty and forced an involuntary reaction. The entire chamber exploded before anyone could stop themselves. Newsom didn't even attempt his trademark smirk, which had died 20 minutes earlier, leaving his face frozen in a neutral block. He looked like someone absorbing massive physical punishment without showing the pain. It was the political version of a boxer curling up and hoping to survive until the end of the round. However, defensive curling doesn't win fights, and the cameras were no longer broadcasting a strong leader. They were transmitting the image of a defeated politician just trying to survive the onslaught. The atmosphere in the room shifted irreversibly. Trump's tone suddenly dropped, and the boisterous entertainer who usually commanded the stage completely vanished. What remained in his place was a remarkably rare sight: a completely serious, unemotional Donald Trump operating with the cold, unyielding focus of a military commander preparing to deliver the final strike. "Governor, I want to discuss the unhoused," he stated flatly. Pulling up a dense state audit manifest, he continued, "In the year 2024, the official California state auditor declared that your regime burned through $24 billion on initiatives designed to mitigate street vagrancy. $24 billion. And that same auditor concluded that your government entirely failed to monitor if the capital was deployed efficiently. You incinerated $24 billion without knowing what it bought. And while you did, the unhoused population only increased. You spent more money on this crisis than anyone in the history of the Republic. And the only result is more people living on the streets. You campaigned heavily on a promise to build 3.5 million homes by 2025, but you only finished 640,000. When reporters asked you about this massive failure, you casually dismissed it as a stretch goal." He paused, displaying the deliberate hesitation of a sniper chambering around. In New York, real estate, promising 3.5 million and delivering 640,000 isn't a stretch goal. It's a scam. But I am being polite today. Currently, 7 independent state agencies are officially labeled high risk for severe mismanagement under your watch, the most in California history. Your own auditor has called your administration the most structurally broken operation the state has ever seen. With surgical intent, Trump laid the audit manifest next to the EDD fraud report, the Panera Law loophole, and the French Laundry dining photo. Adding Williamson's federal indictment sheet, he laid out 6 total documents across his desk. An entire, carefully manicured political career had been systematically destroyed by a small stack of papers. Let me tell you about Maria, a Fresno nail salon owner who employed 23 people. When you forced her to close her doors, she tried calling your EDD for unemployment relief, but she only got busy signals and portal crashes for 3 agonizing weeks. While your staff rapidly approved claims for death row inmates like Scott Peterson, Maria lost her business, her 23 employees lost their jobs, and she fled to Texas. She told me directly that California no longer works for people like her. She started over in Houston simply because your massive bureaucracy couldn't answer the phone for a loyal taxpayer of 19 years. Throughout this brutal recounting, Newsom technically maintained his legendary composure, the same poise that had survived brutal recall elections and decades of political warfare. But in this chamber, that composure mutated into a massive weakness. Looking detached and arrogant while hearing about a woman losing her business to systemic incompetence doesn't project strong leadership. It looks deeply sociopathic, silently screaming, "I am above this," which the entire room now realized was his fundamental flaw. Everyone collectively understood that his belief in his own superiority was the actual disease infecting his state. Governor, you are desperate for the presidency, Trump said, his voice piercing the silence. You have been actively campaigning for it your entire life, and everybody knows it. Even your hair gel knows it. The brief burst of laughter from the gallery was instantly cut off as Trump's face hardened, completely dropping the entertainer persona. He was now fully operating as a former president who knew exactly how to wield unmitigated power. His tone shifted to that of a sitting commander-in-chief mercilessly interrogating an underling who wanted his job. But I have one very basic question, he said, staring through Newsom with the authority of a titan who knew his opponent, looked great while actively crashing the car. You lost $31 billion to fraud, the worst failure in history. Newsom's respiratory rhythm fractured, snapping out of the steady pace he had maintained. He didn't audibly gasp, but a tiny jump in his collarbone betrayed his rising panic. Your top aide is facing federal prison for buying Chanel with stolen funds. His collarbone twitched again as his nervous system prepared for a fatal crash, realizing his emotional defenses were entirely destroyed by 40 minutes of relentless attacks. You burned $24 billion on homelessness with zero data to back it up while street numbers exploded, and you called a massive housing failure a stretch goal. 7 departments are failing. Your billionaire donor got a custom wage loophole you called sausage making, and you dined at the French Laundry without masks for $350 a plate while threatening to punish 40 million people for eating turkey with their families. Leaning into the mic with purely presidential authority, he delivered the fatal blow. Governor, you cannot manage California. Those 6 words were a linguistic payload carrying the absolute entire weight of the hearing. Why should the American public trust you to manage the republic? What followed were 12 excruciating seconds of total silence from the slickest talker in the Democratic Party. Unlike Representative Omar's defiant silence, or AOC's camera-ready theatrical silence, or Hillary's robotic calculating silence. Newsom's silence was the horrific sound of a political brand utterly dying. His clothes, hair, and manufactured West Coast invincibility remained physically perfect. 3 decades of mastering the aesthetic of power were completely undamaged on the surface, but the flawless packaging was completely empty, perfectly resembling an expensive tuxedo worn by a ghost. The perfect exterior had finally run out of substance to protect. His face stayed hardened by years of political survival, but looking composed is not the same thing as actually offering a credible defense. The core question, why he deserved the presidency, couldn't be answered with a handsome jawline. It required a real history of successful governance and kept promises. Tragically for him, his actual track record was a disastrous collection of data, bookended by a $31 billion fraud and a $24 billion homelessness crisis. To the former president, looking at a governor who lost more money to hackers than the entire GDP of Iceland, the brutal answer was obvious. America shouldn't trust him. With a deliberate, agonizing finality, Donald Trump reached across the polished wooden veneer of the dais and firmly snapped his golden-tabbed dossier shut. The sharp, decisive thud of the heavy cardstock closing echoed through the breathless chamber, sounding less like a folder shutting and more like a judge's gavel coming down on a final, irreversible verdict. Leaning back slightly into his leather chair, his facial expression remaining a mask of completely unreadable, stony discipline, he uttered 4 simple, quiet words that managed to hang incredibly heavy in the electrified air of the room. I yield my time. Instantly, the paralyzing, suffocating spell was broken. Governor Gavin Newsom, who had just been locked in a horrific 12-second purgatory of absolute, deeply uncomfortable silence, finally sprang back to life. It was a sudden biological and political reboot. Gripping the edges of his desk and leaning sharply into his microphone, the governor launched into a breathless, hyperkinetic monologue that would ultimately clock in at exactly 2 minutes and 41 seconds of unbroken audio. This was not a spontaneous off-the-cuff defense born of the present moment. Rather, it was an absolute masterclass in pure, distilled political theater. It was the heavily rehearsed, meticulously crafted culmination of a man who had spent the better part of the last 7 years aggressively shadowboxing with the specter of Donald Trump in the privacy of his own head. Every single syllable was fiercely engineered. Every hand gesture was perfectly calibrated for the television cameras, and every vocal inflection was strictly optimized for maximum broadcast impact. Newsom aggressively deployed his greatest rhetorical hits, desperately attempting to change the geography of the battlefield. He projected an aura of absolute confidence, raising his signature baritone voice to passionately praise California's unrivaled technological dominance in Silicon Valley, its sprawling, world-class agricultural empire in the Central Valley, and its vaunted, constantly repeated status as the fifth largest economic engine on the face of the planet. When it came to addressing the catastrophic bureaucratic failures that had just been laid at his feet, he expertly attempted to pivot the narrative. With the polished, slippery grace of a seasoned Sunday morning political talk show guest, he masterfully deflected all blame for the multi-billion-dollar EDD fraud directly onto confusing federal pandemic guidelines. Without missing a single beat, he then aggressively scapegoated the state's crippling systemic housing crisis entirely onto the Federal Reserve's monetary policies. It was a structurally flawless, highly articulate performance that beautifully showcased his undeniable raw talent as a skilled debater. Yet, despite the undeniable cosmetic polish and the rapid-fire delivery of his words, the performance meant absolutely nothing. It was a dazzling, desperate illusion that completely ignored the gaping, bleeding wounds that had been methodically inflicted upon his record during the prior 40 minutes of intense scrutiny. Newsom's frantic defensive monologue entirely bypassed the massive $31 billion in stolen funds hemorrhaged to foreign criminal syndicates. He conveniently forgot to mention Julie Su's actively deleted anti-fraud safeguards. He offered absolutely zero explanation or apology for his hypocritical, unmasked feast at the French Laundry, completely dodged the corrupt Panera bread donor loophole, and failed to utter a single solitary syllable regarding his own chief of staff's devastating federal felony fraud charges. His standard, media-ready rhetorical shields were completely and utterly powerless against a ruthless opponent who was strictly demanding a tangible track record of executive competence that simply did not exist anywhere in reality. Across the room, Trump offered absolutely no rebuttals or interruptions. He just sat there and watched the governor in total, unbroken silence, his cold eyes firmly locked on his target. He looked exactly like a patient, calculating apex predator observing its wounded prey thrash desperately about and slowly bleed out on the floor, fully content in the absolute knowledge that the brutal battle was already over. The internet reacted instantly, starting with a viral clip of Trump revealing that Scott Peterson received state funds. That tiny 8-second video generated 31 million views immediately, thriving on its own twisted irony without needing extra context. The second major viral hit was the story of Nuke Bizzle, the rapper who literally bragged about stealing state cash in a music video. This clip rapidly spread through online communities focused on dark political humor. The surreal combination of government failure and internet culture acted as pure algorithmic fuel, cementing the disastrous narrative. The third major piece of content was Trump methodically listing Dana Williamson's federal indictments, ending with the devastating line about missing her massive expense reports. This quote quickly became the universal shorthand for the entire Newsom hearing, much like the "Who is the liar" meme from the Omar trial. It was repeated by late-night hosts, featured in countless articles, and eagerly saved by political opponents. But the ultimate fatal blow to Newsom's 2028 dreams was the phrase, "You cannot manage California The agonizing 12-second silence following those 6 words required absolutely no commentary from pundits. The 6 words acted as the trial, and the 12 seconds of silence acted as the execution. The real-world consequences were immediate and catastrophic, destroying a presidential campaign before it even officially began. Attorney General Kash Patel launched a massive DOJ racketeering investigation into California's handling of federal pandemic money. The probe expanded way past the EDD to include emergency shelters and Medi-Cal, sending subpoenas to high-ranking figures like Julie Su. At the same time, reports broke that Dana Williamson's legal team was negotiating an immunity deal, facing severe prison time for stealing $225,000 and faking $1.7 million in taxes. Her only option was to testify against the governor's closest allies. Newsom's 2028 polling numbers plummeted instantly from 27% to 16%, dropping him far behind competitors like Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro. The voters didn't necessarily hate him. They just entirely lost faith in his ability to govern effectively. That 6-word phrase, "you cannot manage California," became an insurmountable psychological wall blocking his path to the presidency. Within days, fellow Democrats were secretly using the disaster against him through dark money ads and donor calls. Whitmer's team emphasized executive management, while Shapiro's PAC bought ads in Pennsylvania, specifically highlighting the massive $31 billion fraud. They didn't even have to say Newsom's name because Trump had already destroyed him for them. Meanwhile, the steady trickle of businesses leaving California turned into a frantic mass exit. States like Nevada, Texas, and Florida used the C-SPAN footage to lure away companies, even putting up billboards in Austin mocking the lost $31 billion. Spooked by the financial incompetence, 3 mid-sized tech companies publicly announced they were leaving the state. Desperate to stop the bleeding, Newsom held a heavily scripted press conference where he repeated his tired 5th largest economy talking points. However, the staged event totally failed, earning only 4,000 retweets while drowning in widespread criticism. By contrast, Trump's video mentioning Scott Peterson hit 31 million views. That devastating ratio of 4,000 to 31 million acted as the official autopsy report for Newsom's political life. It proved that cold, hard facts will always defeat shallow Hollywood PR. The next morning, Trump posted on Truth Social, "Newsom lost $31 billion to hackers and inmates. I've built skyscrapers worth more than his whole government can keep track of." Down in the humid, sun-baked expanse of Madisonville, Louisiana, where the heavy summer air clung to the Spanish moss and the scent of brackish water permeated everything, Gerald Thibodeau stood behind the worn wooden counter of his family-owned bait and tackle shop. The rhythmic hum of the aerators and the minnow tanks provided a constant background noise to the small television perched precariously on a shelf of dusty fishing line spools. Gerald, a man whose hands were calloused from decades of honest, grueling labor, leaned heavily against the ancient cash register, his eyes locked on a news broadcast rerun playing out on the flickering screen. A regular customer, an older woman with a sun-weathered face, paused from inspecting a stack of wire crawfish traps and stared at the broadcast. "Is that the California governor?" she asked, her brow furrowed in mild confusion as she observed the impeccably groomed politician on the screen. "That's him," Gerald replied, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and quiet disgust. He slowly shook his head. He lost $31 billion. The customer stopped completely, her hands hovering over the wire mesh. She shook her head, her mind physically unable to comprehend an astronomical figure of that magnitude. It wasn't a number that existed in the reality of Madisonville or any other working-class town. Packing her order into a faded brown paper bag with deliberate practiced movements, Gerald felt a sudden surge of frustration. "My dad used to say," Gerald noted, his tone turning sharp, If you somehow manage to lose track of $31 billion, you shouldn't even be trusted to run a neighborhood lemonade stand. And honestly, even then, someone better be standing right there to audit the lemons. As the woman pushed open the creaky screen door, letting in a blast of cicada-filled heat, the television broadcast echoed President Donald Trump's devastating phrase, "You cannot manage California." The screen door slammed shut, but the words hung heavily in the stagnant air of the shop. Gerald straightened a display of brightly colored fishing spinners, his mind still wrestling with the sheer scale of the incompetence. $31 billion, he muttered to himself, the syllables feeling heavy on his tongue. That is not just a political mistake or a minor bureaucratic scandal. That is the entire wealth of a whole country. That's a sovereign nation just vanishing into thin air. Hundreds of miles away, in the gray, industrial heart of Middletown, Ohio, a profoundly exhausted healthcare worker named Crystal Atkins sat slumped in the sterile, fluorescent-lit break room of the Brighter Days Recovery Center. The clinic was a battleground against addiction, a place where miracles and tragedies happened daily, and Crystal bore the emotional weight of it all in the dark circles under her eyes. Her coworker, Donna, sat across from her, quietly sipping a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee as Crystal passionately articulated what she believed was the true meaning behind the endless parade of televised political disasters they had witnessed over the years. Do you realize what all of these sagas, all 8 of these massive political trials we've been watching, fundamentally boil down to? Crystal asked, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of fatigue and righteous anger. "What's that?" Donna replied softly, offering a sympathetic ear. "It all comes down to trust," Crystal explained, leaning forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "We hand these individuals massive budgets, corner offices, unquestioned authority, and a sizable chunk of our hard-earned paychecks. We blindly trust them to execute the assignment, to look out for us, yet they all systematically manipulated and betrayed that faith. Representative Omar shielded racketeering while pretending to be a savior. AOC built a massive social media empire and funneled grassroots donations into her own pockets. Clinton stockpiled generational wealth under the guise of public service, and Gavin Newsom, he literally vaporized $31 billion, locked us all in our homes, and told us we were selfish for wanting to see our families, all while he was feasting at the ultra-exclusive French Laundry. He carved out special minimum wage exemptions for his billionaire friends, and he sat back while his shadow manager bought luxury designer purses with stolen taxpayer cash. Donna quietly nodded, staring into her coffee. "That is an overwhelming amount of corruption to even think about," she murmured. "These are 8 unique scandals," Crystal observed, leaning back into her rigid plastic chair. "But the underlying disease infecting all of them is exactly the same. It is the vast, unforgiving chasm between their polished television personas and their ruthless, self-serving reality. Omar claims to help her city, but actively hurts the police. AOC claims to champion the working class, but spends thousands on luxury therapy. And Newsom swaggers around on stages, claiming he is a global leader, but he bleeds billions to death row inmates and internet scammers." Crystal turned her attention fully to the television mounted in the section, which, that's silence right there. That is what is truly terrifying, because it's the deafening silence of an elite politician who has absolutely no answer when he is finally, truly asked what he actually did with the power we gave him. They freeze like that because the truthful answer is simply, "I used it to help myself." Looking down at her own rough, severely washed hands, hands that had scrubbed ceramic mugs, held the hands of weeping addicts, and worked tirelessly for 9 years, she continued her thought. "The ultimate difference between us and those untouchable politicians living on that screen is that we actually do our jobs. We show up, we clock in. Rosa shows up to the salon. Gerald shows up to the bait counter. I show up right here, every single shift. We don't have offshore funds or elite restaurant reservations. We just answer the phones and do the hard work. The royalty on that screen abandoned their posts a decade ago. They show up when the cameras are rolling, but they completely abandon the people standing in 3-week unemployment queues where nobody even bothers to pick up the receiver. She stood up, walked to the sink, rinsed her mug with scalding hot water, and placed it aggressively on the metal drying rack with a sharp clatter. Without another word, she pushed through the swinging doors, walking back out into the ward to help broken people fight actual life or death demons. Leaving the television playing to an empty, silent room, on the screen, the broadcast continued to loop the most devastating moment of the entire hearing. You cannot manage California, so why should the public trust you with the Republic? The voice challenged. Those 12 seconds of agonizing dead air that followed proved definitively that the Democratic Party's presumed top candidate had completely and utterly frozen under the intense pressure of reality. His heavily produced, meticulously crafted political future had just crashed violently into a massive, impenetrable wall of objective facts, a wall that no amount of Hollywood public relations, slick hair gel, or rehearsed talking points could ever fix. If you have survived to this timestamp in the video, you have just witnessed the total collapse of a political empire. Destroy the like button below if you agree that President Trump successfully proved that you absolutely cannot charm, smile, or debate your way out of a $31 billion crater of absolute incompetence. Subscribe to this channel for more deep analytical dives where hard, undeniable evidence completely dismantles scripted political theater. Comment down below to tell us which specific attack you think was the absolute worst. Was it the luxury Chanel handbag bought with stolen funds? Was it the fact that taxpayers funded Scott Peterson on death row? Or was it the brutal, devastating 12-second void of silence? Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The Department of Justice investigation is officially active. His chief of staff is actively cooperating with federal authorities to save herself, and Gavin Newsom has absolutely nowhere left to hide. He showed up to that hearing armed with a rehearsed monologue. Trump showed up documenting an active, massive crime scene. May God protect the hardworking citizens who were trapped on hold while felons cashed their state-funded checks, and the everyday families who had their Thanksgiving traditions shattered while their governor feasted in luxury. You cannot manage California governor, and the disastrous state of California itself stands as the absolute, undeniable proof. God bless.